We're in Basi Legani from Tu B'Shvat, Tafshin Lamed Ches. Yesterday was Tu B'Shvat. And we're gearing up for the 30th anniversary of Chav Bei Shvat, of the Rebbetzins Yartzeit, which is Chav Bei Shvat, that's next week. So we're learning this Maimer, the Rebbe said, on Tu B'Shvat, Tafshin Lamed Ches, that was 40 years ago, yesterday. And but the Rebbe had edited it and prepared it for publication for the first Yartzeit of Chav Bei Shvat. So we learned already chapter 1. Now we're holding chapter 2. In our booklets, we're on page Nun Tes in the Basi Legani booklets of this year. So, what did we said in chapter 1 that the revelation of godliness that came into this. What's going on? That's fine. So we quoted from the Medrash. Generally, when we quote Basi Legani, we quote the Medrash from Shir Hashirim, where the Medrash says that when was the Shechina Lamata? When did the Shechina come into this world? When was Basi Legani? When did Hashem say, when did I come to my garden? That was when the Mishkan was built. And that's when Hashem came and was in his home in this world, was in the Mishkan. But there's another Medrash that says that when was it that Hashem comes down to this world? Like it says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. Hashem came down on Mount Sinai. When did Hashem come down on Mount Sinai? That's Mount Torah, the giving of the Torah. And then the Medrash continues. In the very next sentence is Ve'ei Masai b'yem shokam HaMishkan. When was it? It was when the Mishkan was built. So the Rebbe explains that the main hamshacha of the Shechina Lamata, the main experience, the main moment when the Shechina was down here in this world, revealed in this world, that was at the Mishkan, when the Mishkan was built. Mount Torah, Mount Sinai, there was a temporary. Yes, Hashem came down into this world. Yes, it was the Shechina was Lamata, was down here in this world, but it was only temporary. Why? Because he explains the difference is like this. By Mount Torah, the giving of the Torah came from above. That was Hashem's initiative. We didn't do anything for God to warrant God giving us the Torah. He did it on his own. He came, he revealed himself to us, and he gave us the Torah. By the Mishkan, though, it says V'asuli Migdash, that you build the Mishkan for me, that we build the Mishkan. So what's the difference? So we explain, when there's a hamshacha milmayla that comes from above, when you're given something from above that's undeserved or that you're not prepared for, so then it's something that's imposed on you. It's not something that transforms you, because you are not really receptive to it. So an example would be, you have a teacher that comes into class to teach, and the students don't know anything about the subject he's going to teach. So what happens if you're a good student and you can grasp what he's saying? So you might be able to repeat and remember. You can remember everything he said. You can repeat the entire class, and maybe it's even an advanced class. You can repeat it, but you're not going to know anything beyond that. And furthermore, if you're not going to further explore the matter, it's not going to be long before you will start to forget what he said, because it's something that's totally unrelatable to you, not something that you're prepared to know. Whereas if you prepare for something and you study something and you have all this other knowledge that helps you prepare for that class, and then you understand it at a different level. Then what you understand is not just that you can repeat words that were said, but you can grasp the concept. So the same idea, when Hashem comes on Har Sinai, so he comes down to this world, there's a revelation, there's Shechina Lamata, but it doesn't have a transformative effect on the world. Why? Because it came from above, it didn't come from below. So, meaning that we weren't really receptive to that revelation. We received it, we were receptive to an extent, but it wasn't fully transformative. And therefore, right after Mount Torah, what happens? Hashem goes off the mountain, and the mountain becomes a regular mountain, like all other mountains in the desert. So when Hashem comes to the mountain, we weren't allowed to go near the mountain. They had to separate it. We weren't allowed to go on the mountain because it was holy. But after he leaves, we were able to go on the mountain. But then when it comes to the Mishkan, so the building the Mishkan, since that comes from Lamata, since that comes from us, our efforts in building the Mishkan, we build a home for Hashem. That means that we become sensitive, and therefore we become a proper vessel. We become conducive to being able to receive the godliness. And so therefore, when Hashem comes down into the world in that capacity, in that fashion, so then it becomes transformative. Then that's the ultimate Shechina Lamata. So in other words, if the point is that we should have that God should have a home in the lowest realms, in the lowest place. So what does it mean? So what does it mean that when Hashem comes down himself, he imposes sort of his presence on this world? If the world is not receptive to it, then it means that the world, in its own form and shape and experience, is not receptive to godliness, meaning that he's not there, as it were. So the ultimate Shechina Lamata, in the lowest realms, is when we bring it about, when we make it happen. So that's number one, is that the Shechina, what was the greater revelation that happened through the Mishkan, as opposed to Matan Torah, receiving the Torah, was that we were receptive to it. So the Shechina comes all the way down. And in fact, in note 10, the Rebbe says over here that if you can't fully penetrate something, so that's not only it's not only a flaw in the thing you're trying to penetrate. It's also a flaw in the light itself. So the light that's trying to go into a vessel, if it doesn't enter the vessel, it's not just because the vessel itself is not receptive. There's something wrong with the vessel. But even the light itself is a limited light. There's a place that it can't reach. So it means that it's not the ultimate form of light if there's somewhere it can't go. But then the Rebbe says something else, which is that when we make the Mishkan, it's not only that by making the Mishkan, we become receptive to godliness. We are then make a home for godliness, which then, so therefore it can penetrate in a pnimius, in an internalized fashion. But there's more to it than that. And that is that when we make the Mishkan, what are we doing? As is discussed in the Hemshech of the Hilula, the Hemshech of Basi Legani, in the Maimer, in those Mamarim, is that we transform the foolishness of this world into foolishness of holiness. What happens when we do that? When it's not just that one step is that we are the ones who bring it about, so that means that it comes in a pnimius. But more than that, how are we going about building that home? By transforming the ungodly into the godly, by transforming the foolishness of this world into foolishness of holiness. And what happens when we do that? Then we have another advantage, which is then there's the Yisra Na'ir Min HaCheshech. There's the enhanced light that comes from the darkness. So there's light that's a great light, and there could be a light that's very powerful, but then there's an even more powerful light, a greater light, one that comes from the darkness, already a different light. And so when we talk about building the Mishkan, what happens? We have two things. Number one, we have this idea that it comes into the world in an internalized fashion. It's absorbed within the world. The world becomes sensitive and therefore receptive to godliness. It's not something that's imposed on it, but it itself is receptive to it. And number two, when we do that through transforming the folly of this world into holiness, so now we're bringing about an even greater light as well. So now let's get into chapter 2. So, but we see though that there's a difference between the Va'asuli Migdash, what happened when we built the Mishkan, and the revelation at Sinai. The revelation came from above. What's greater? The building of the Mishkan was a greater service than the giving of the Torah, which wasn't a service at all. It came totally from above. Yet the Rebbe says, chapter 2, that really even this idea that we have an ability to make a home for God, where'd that come from? That also came from Mount Sinai. So even though Mount Sinai itself, that revelation was a lower level, but it was that experience that opened the door, that paved the way for us to be able to then go about and make a mikdash, make a home for God. So that's chapter 2. So it's known that the revelation at Sinai was that cataclysmic event. That was the major event that then opened the door for everything else. Everything that followed. So there's before Matan Torah and then there's after. And so everything that comes after, as great as it will be, even that it's greater than what happened at the revelation itself, but all of it comes from that experience at Mount Sinai. All of the ability, everything that we have, the capacity to serve Hashem, all that was given to us, that ability was given to us at Mount Sinai. Even though the energy that we can draw from God, the godliness that we can access through our service, and especially when we're talking about transformation of unholy to holy, even though, as we said before, what we do at building the temple for Hashem is greater than the revelation that was experienced at Mount Sinai. Nevertheless, the fact that we have that ability to reach that higher level, that we can make a home for Hashem, that was also that was already given to us. That ability was given to us potentially at Mount Sinai. So, but at Mount Sinai we have two things. Yeah, we said there are two components to this, to the advantage of building a Mishkan over the revelation at Sinai, which was that the revelation at Sinai, since it came entirely from above, so therefore, it didn't penetrate the physical world. The world itself didn't become refined, didn't become sensitive and receptive to godliness. It was sort of imposed on it. That was one thing. And the other thing was that we can transform That's one advantage of the Basi Legani. But the other thing was also there's a transformation of darkness to light. So how is it that at Mount Sinai, the idea that we can have avodah, there's a revelation from godliness, there's a shchina's lamata ba'aretz, that paves the way that we should be able to bring the shchina lamata ba'aretz through our avodah. But where do we see this idea of transformation of darkness to light? Especially if we consider the fact that Mount Sinai, there was a revelation that came entirely from above. There was no darkness. It was all light. So where did we get that ability from? In other words, just like anything, any qualities we have, they're embedded in our DNA. We got it from somewhere. It didn't just come from the Levana. You get it from somewhere. So where is it where do we trace this power, the capacity to make a home for God, to bring the Shekhinah down here, is when God himself came down here. That gives us the ability to ourselves, through Avodah, to bring him down. But where do we see this idea that we can transform darkness into light? That second level of the advantage of the Mishkan, that we can transform it. So he says, that the fact that we have through Matan Torah, we had the potential for us to be able to bring godliness down here through our service. But and also the additional advantage of the greater light that comes from darkness. This is because even though Mount Sinai was just God coming down, revealing himself, making a home, so to speak, in this world, but Matan Torah came after Yisro arrived. Right, the giving Torah in this week's parsha, it's in Parshas Yisro. So it's discussed at length this idea that the Matan Torah, which seems to be, if that's the central pinnacle event of Judaism, is like hidden, so to speak, in the parsha called Yisro, about Yisro. Called the parsha by Matan Torah. This is the most important critical event in our history, but it's called Parshas Yisro. So what's Yisro? Point is that Matan Torah only came after Yisro. Yisro was a necessary preparation for Mount Sinai. Had to come first. So Matan Torah comes after Yisro said, the opening of this week's parsha, Ata Yadaiti, now I know, Ki Godel Havaya Mikol Alikim, that God is greater, Havaya is greater than all gods. And Kedisa B'Zohar, so the Zohar explains, Sha'idei Shahoida Yisro, that through Yisro's acknowledgement, and he said, his admission, he says, V'amar, and he says, Ata Yadaiti Ki Godel Havaya Gomer, when Yisro came and comes to the desert, comes to the Jewish people and says, now I know that God is great, is greater than all other gods. So at that moment is istalik v'isyaker kuchabrichu b'karei ila v'tata. That at that moment, so God was great. His greatness was enhanced, and He was revealed in great glory above and below. Ulevasar, and afterwards He gives the Torah. So Yisro comes, he says what he says, and that sort of glorifies God above and below, and all kinds of things. And afterwards, God gives the Torah. And through this, so through this, that Matan Torah came after Yisro's acknowledgement. So through that was Nasa Yisro and Kivayachol Matan Torah. This, in a sense, and you could say, enhanced the experience of Matan Torah. That even though, as we explained earlier, Matan Torah was on God's initiative. It came entirely from above, without any effort from below. Nevertheless, the fact that it was prefaced by Yisro's admission and acknowledgement of God, so that enhanced even the experience of Mount Sinai. Similar to the advantage and the light that comes from the darkness. So in other words, we're saying that after that Matan Torah, we were given the ability to both bring godliness into this world, and also to do it in a fashion of transforming darkness into light, which means that we're bringing an even higher level. So the question is, that God comes down to this world. Okay, so He comes down to the world. That gives us the ability to then go about doing it ourselves. Just like, you want to teach somebody how to do something. Excuse me. So you show them how to do it. You do it first, and then it becomes easier for them to do it. God comes down to this world, then we have that ability. But where did we see this transformation of darkness to light? How is that ability given to us? So the way it was given to us, as we explained, quoting from the Zohar, that because Matan Torah came after Yisro, he kind of did that. He acknowledges God, saying God is greater than all other gods. So Yisro is an idolater. We're going to get into this topic a little bit more, obviously, at length now in the next chapter, so we'll explore this more. But the point is that Yisro, who was an idolater, an expert idolater at that, comes to the acknowledgement, to the realization that God is greater after he had gone through all of these things, so that is a form of transformation of darkness to light. And so this, then, after that comes Matan Torah, and so this experience of Yisrael was now embedded in Matan Torah. It gives us the ability to then transform darkness to light, to make a Mishkan in the form of being mahapech shtus tulumas at the shtus kedusha. So, but we just said before that Matan Torah came totally from above. So, did it come from above or did it come from Yisrael? What brought it about? So the Rebbe explains, since by Matan Torah, the giving of Torah came from above on God's initiative. It wasn't that Yisrael was the one, through his efforts, that's what God suddenly decides is going to give the Torah. God was giving us the Torah. But it's just that there was this event that happened beforehand that affected, to an extent, this event. But not that it caused it. Not that it brought it about. So therefore, through this, since it wasn't that Yisrael was the one who brought about Matan Torah, but Matan Torah came from above. It was just that this event came before. So therefore, already embedded in the experience of Matan Torah, since this preceded it, so therefore we also had that potential, the potential for it, the ability for it already in Matan Torah. So through that, we were also given this potential, this ability, so that through us actually transforming the darkness into light, we have that, we can go about that form of service of transforming the darkness into light. Okay. So it wasn't that Yisrael causes Matan Torah. It wasn't that he served Hashem in a manner that then brought about Matan Torah. Matan Torah was coming unconditionally from above. But since before Matan Torah, Yisrael, and by the way, if you look in the words of the Zohar, so now it's more clear. The Zohar, it's almost like he divides it into two things. There's Yisrael comes and says, that God is great. And as a result was his stalik, God is great, enhanced, and above and below. And then afterwards, God gives us the Torah. Not that led to the giving of the Torah. There's two things. There was this that happened first, and then after this event, so then God gives us the Torah. But it wasn't that Yisrael brought it about. So therefore, since it was only something that was merely like a sort of an introduction, but not an actual preparation, so therefore, that ability was given to us in potential. And then we have to go about, then we have that potential, we have the ability to then go about transforming darkness to light. Chapter 3. So, based on this, we can explain what's discussed and explained in many mamarim. What does this mean? That before Matan Torah we needed Yisrael. Of all things, that Yisrael was this such an important event of Matan Torah. Yisrael was the event that had to come before it. So the Mamar, so Chassidus explains like this: the Yuvin zabahaktim hashakasav v'isi ani sheyashis and lachachma min asichlos kisrei min achayshach. So this concept is explained by explaining a pasuk that it says. The pasuk says, Shlomo Melech, the wisest of all men, says v'reisi ani aisi. Ecclesiastes. Shlomo Melech is called Keles after he reached this great level of wisdom. Once Shlomo Melech was the great wise Shlomo Melech, so you have Keles, his great wisdom. So what does he say? So he says, we know, we've been quoting plenty the second part of the pasuk, Yisrei no'or min ha'choshech, the light, the enhanced light that comes from darkness. But there's a first part. What's the pasuk say? V'reisi ani sheyesh Yisrei l'chachma min ha'sichlos. He says, I've seen that there is an advantage to wisdom over folly, over foolishness. Ki Yisrei no'or min ha'choshech, like the advantage of light over darkness. So the l'chayr ain't moving. It's not. So this verse requires some explanation. We don't understand. The Zohar itself actually asks this question. The Zohar asks, why is it that the pasuk says that I saw, meaning Shlomo, the wisest of all men, Duh. This is the words from the Zohar. The Zohar says, everybody knows. You don't have to be a scholar, you don't have to be wise to know that wisdom is greater than foolishness. So why is it that the pasuk says, Shlomo is giving you want some wisdom? Here's a word from the wise, that wisdom is greater than foolishness. What's the great chiddush? What's he saying here? It's something that should be self-evident to everybody. So the explanation is Shakavana b'sichlas kan hilay l'shtus kipshuta, ela l'chachmas chitzonius shem sichlas l'gabe chachmas hatayra. So the explanation is that when Shlomo says there's an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, what is he saying? Not just wisdom over. Everybody knows that wisdom is greater than foolishness. But what he's saying is wisdom meaning chachma of Torah wisdom, and that's greater than chachmas chitzonius, than secular wisdom. And what does he call secular wisdom? He calls secular wisdom sichlus, foolishness. In other words, you could say that godly wisdom, Torah, is greater than secular wisdom. So there's wisdom. This is one type of wisdom. This is wisdom itself. There's greater wisdom, and there's there are things that are more sophisticated, things that are deeper concepts, and things that are less. Even within disciplines, you have your whatever 101, your entry level. You have your elementary level, then you get an advanced level of wisdom. So you have different levels. So there's the secular wisdom, and Torah wisdom is greater. He doesn't say that. He says that the advantage of wisdom of Torah, he compares Chachmat Chatzoni, secular wisdom, to foolishness. So it's not just a difference in degree, but that they're totally incomparable. The Torah is beyond secular wisdom, like wisdom is to foolishness. So that's what Shlomo Melech is saying. So the wise woman. So now already that's an explanation, right? But the Rebbe is going to explain that even that is not. When you talk about divine wisdom, which is infinite, so of course it's ein aroich. Of course you can't. There's no comparison between divine wisdom and secular wisdom and world wisdom. So Chassidus explains that what Shlomo Melech is saying, that there's a yisur l'chachma min hasichlos, which means that even though we're talking about secular wisdom and we're calling it foolishness, so foolishness, it's obviously there's no connection, there's no way to measure between the Chachma of Torah and Chachma of Olam Hazeh and secular wisdom. Nevertheless, Shlomo Melech is saying that there's an advantage in Chachma of Torah that comes from the secular wisdom. In other words, that there's Chachma of Torah and there's secular wisdom that's foolishness. And yet there's an advantage. Chachma of Torah is enhanced. There's a greater Chachma of Torah that comes from the foolishness, from that secular wisdom. That's already a statement. That we'll explain. So he says, Vabir Bazeh. So explanation is Shakavana B'Sichlus Kan. When we're talking about foolishness here, so in the verse, he's We're not talking about obvious foolishness, because as the Zohar asks, everybody knows that. But we're talking about a secular wisdom that he calls foolishness in comparison to the wisdom of Torah. And this is what the verse says. And it's on this that Shlomo Melech says that I have seen, that Shlomo, the wisest of all men, see the advantage of Chachma of Torah, of Chachma of wisdom over foolishness, like the advantage of light over darkness. Why is he also, in the verse, wisdom is greater than foolishness. That's a very hard concept to understand. I need to give you an example. I'll give you a comparison. Just like light greater than darkness. Why do you need an explanation? It should be also, first of all, it's self-understood. Second of all, it's not such a hard thing to comprehend. What's he saying? That just as we say about darkness and light, that the light itself is a greater light when it comes from the darkness, that when the darkness is transformed to light, then the light is enhanced. As explained at length in the Hemshech of the Basi Leganis. The same is true with regard to Chachma, wisdom. And when we say wisdom here, we're talking about the Torah wisdom, V'sichlos, and foolishness, which is Chachmas Chitzoni, secular wisdom. When we transform and refine the secular wisdom and bring it to holiness, so Nasa Yisrin Vaysafa B'Chachma D'Kedusha, that enhances the wisdom of holiness. And this is why, this brings us back to that thing. Why is it that Yisroi, that event of Yisroi coming and acknowledging God as the greatest, needed to happen before Matan Torah? It's ki Yisroi Chacham Gadol B'Chachmas Chitzenis. In other words, now that we've explained that there's an enhancement in Chachma of Torah, when you transform Chachma of L'um Hazeh, when you transform secular wisdom and unholy wisdom, you transform that enhances Chachma of Torah. Now we can understand that when the Hashem gives us Torah, so when it's just Chachma of Torah coming from above, that's one level of Chachma. But there's a Yisrain, there's an enhancement, there's an advantage to Chachma, meaning wisdom of Torah, that comes from transforming unholy Chachma, wisdom. So how would that happen if the whole thing came from above, without any transformation of Chachma of L'um Hazeh? So that's the event of Yisroi. That Yisroi, who was a Chacham Gadol, Yisroi was a very great scholar in secular wisdom. And through Yisroi, coming to acknowledge, after having experienced all this and understanding everything that there was to understand and mastered secular wisdom, as a result of that, he comes to the conclusion that God that God is greater than all of this. So through that, that then transforms the secular wisdom that becomes transformed into godly wisdom. This then enhances, in turn, divine wisdom that in a greater way than it would have been on its own. Now we can also understand something. Now that we've explained this, that Yisrael was about transforming secular wisdom and then acknowledging godliness, acknowledging God, divine wisdom, that enhances divine wisdom. So now we can understand why it says Yisrael. It says we had 7 names. So it says that Yisrael was called Yisrael. Why? So the Medrash says that Yisrael. Why was he called Yisrael? Because he increased another parsha, another section in the Torah. There's a parsha in this week's parsha. Yisrael sees Moshe dealing with the Yidden on his own all day and all night, and he says, "This is not good. We need to come up with a new plan." And so Yisrael devises a plan that you should appoint judges. Basically, you have lower court judges and higher court judges, and a whole system, a whole infrastructure of judges and people to answer questions addressed to people. That is a whole paragraph. It's a whole section in Torah, and that was all from Yisrael. That was Yisrael's contribution to Torah. So why was he called Yisrael, which means to increase? Because he increased. It's called Yeser. Yeser also means an increase. V'lama nikra b'shem Yeser, l'fnei shita parsha b'Torah. He was called Yisrael because he added a parsha in Torah. Why was he called Yeser before he added the parsha in Torah? Why was he still called Yeser? So al pi anal yeshlemar, based on what we said before, we can explain. Hashem Yeser meloshin Yisrael. The name Yeser, which also means to increase an advantage. Shahaya nikra by mekaydem hu mitzad Yisrael. Why was he called that? Because he was very intelligent, and obviously seichel, intellect, is greater than the emotions. Even in secular wisdom, which before we called foolishness, but even there, intelligence is greater than emotions, is higher than emotions. And therefore he's called Yeser because he's an intellectual. But Chassidus explains the difference between secular wisdom and divine wisdom is that secular wisdom leads to greater ego, a greater enhanced ego. You become more full of yourself. The more you know, the more full of yourself you become. You see that wise people, many generally are very full of themselves. But Torah, at least if you're studying Torah and recognizing that it's godly, so the more wisdom, the more bittul, the more humility. The more Torah knowledge, the more humble the person is. If a person's ego is inflated through study Torah, then something is wrong with that picture. But that's the difference. So Chachma of Lu'um Hazeh increases ego. And so therefore that's very negative. So the more, even the wisdom is greater than emotions, it's the highest pursuit of man, but it has a negative effect. Whereas the Chachma of Torah leads to humility. So even though there's a Ma'ila since Chachma of wisdom, of secular wisdom, is great arrogance, and therefore we find there's a greater fall for the intelligent one, for the intellectual, than there is for the emotional. Somebody who's emotional, could be reckless, could be careless, maybe lets their emotions get the better of themselves. But it's the truly dangerous are the intellectuals, people that have a sort of a worldview, an intellectual understanding of something that could then sort of rationalize even the worst behavior. And that's in a way much more dangerous, much more evil than even somebody who's just emotional. That's more sinister, more evil. We find, in very practical terms, we find that when it becomes a philosophy, so that leads the greatest mass murders, the greatest atrocities were performed by people that had very, very intelligent, that were very wise, that had worldviews. And it was those worldviews, that intelligence, that led to the greatest descent into the lowest levels. So when we talk about the advantage of wisdom, even secular wisdom, so true, there's an advantage to wisdom over intellect, over emotion, and yet, like the Gemara says, that we know that an animal, even a kosher animal, but if it has a terminal illness, is treif, is not kosher. So the halacha is that if an animal has an additional hind leg, an added one, so that's like a terminal illness, the animal's not kosher. Why? So the Gemara says, because kol yeser kinatul dami. Even though you say, what's better than 4 legs? 5 legs, right? But no, an extra leg is as if he's missing one. So it's obvious that something's missing a limb that's got an issue. So yes, or cannot dummy. So here, ultimately it's a net negative secular wisdom. Well, Achish in his guy vita parsha achas b'Torah, and after Yisrei converted and added the parsha in Torah nikra b'shem Yisrei b'Tosfos Vav. Then his name went from Yeser, which shows on secular wisdom, and at the advantage of secular wisdom, which is Yeser. But then he was given a Vav. The Vav made al Torah. Vav represents Torah. Kedisa b'Zohar, like the Zohar says, Shavav is emes. The Zohar says that Vav is the letter of truth. Ve'ein emes al Torah, and we know the Gemara says that Torah is emes. What's emes? When we say emes is Torah. So So this idea that he's called Yisrei after Yitar Parsha B'Torah with a Vav shows that his greatness was, the advantage was in the divine wisdom of Torah, not in the secular wisdom.
According to the Yeser and Yisrei is the same. It's one name. It's not two names.
But they're exact opposites.
Yeah.
No, Fakert. There are two names. Yisrei had 7 names.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
But one of them was Yeser, one of them was Yisrei. So they're clearly two. Here, this explains why they're two different names. And it's been a Kotza la Kotza. There's Yeser because he's a Chacham and Chachmas of Teinis, and then there's Yisrei because of Chachmas of Torah. They're not they're incomparable.